Hi everyone, and thank you very much for having me back. I feel very disappointed with myself that I haven't got audience participation in my presentation. Although I'm really tempted to get Dustin out just to just to kind of get everyone in a really in a really kind of positive mood. I'm Matt. Most of the time, I'm a consultant. I specialize in recruitment marketing, innovation in talent acquisition, and HR technology. And these are just some of the companies that I've worked with recently. However, today I'm gonna be talking to you about some of the learnings that I've had from running my podcast for 2 years. I started the podcast because I liked podcasts and I like playing around with audio, and also I love doing research and talking to lots of practitioners all over the world in the talent acquisition space to find out what's going on, to see if I can kind of aggregate those learnings and bring them to a wider audience. So it was kind of started as a labour of love, and it really, for whatever reason, has kind of really taken off. So 14,000 people listen to it every month now, and I've done 107 interviews. On the back of it, I've also written a book that was out in May. For those of you who were here last year, you'll remember my panic slide, because I was in the middle of trying to finish this book and I was panicking, but I've done it, and it's kind of out. Before I sort of start sharing some of the insights that I've learned from doing these interviews, I just wanted to share with you the philosophy behind the podcast in terms of my approach to it, what I'm looking for, and also what's going on in the space globally when we talk about the future of recruitment and technology. There's a kind of a huge amount of noise out there. So I just want to give you a little bit of insight into my philosophy behind it. Now, has anyone seen a diagram like this before? A few people have. A few people haven't. This is a kind of a map of technology uptake, but equally it could be new ideas in a sector. And really, the point is that you have something. Let's think of an example. So, for example, the iPhone 10 comes out in a few weeks' time at a retail price of $1,000 and probably €1,000, the way that Apple moved their price across. Who is going to be first in line to buy an iPhone 10? Okay, so probably there was a couple of people. So we'll call these people the sort of the innovators, the people who are always first in line when new technology and new ideas happen. After that, you kind of have the visionaries, the people who kind of run with this new technology and these new ideas. And I think we can see this in terms of recruitment technology as well. So very often, the people who talk about innovation and the future of recruitment and technology at conferences are in this. Oh, can I do this? Oh, look at this. This is brilliant. Are kind of in this. You see, you are an innovator with this technology. Are in this kind of phase. And what you get between the early adopters and the early majority of people who are taking up new ideas is this. I need to stop doing this. Is this kind of big chasm? And I've noticed that very often that there can be a gap between people who are kind of running with new ideas and then the reality of most people being able to take those ideas back to their business or take those technologies back to their business and implement them, and most people can't for a variety of reasons. So you kind of have this chasm in between, where there's a kind of a gap between what the early adopters are doing and what most of us are able to do. And if you actually imagine it as a chasm, I was trying to find a picture of a chasm. It's actually quite difficult, but here's a picture of a chasm. And imagine if you were stuck in this chasm. There's probably quite a lot of echo in this chasm, so there's a lot of noise going on. And I think that a lot of the noise and the conversations, and we were talking about how boring Facebook can get from a recruiter's arguing with each other perspective these days. It's kind of echoing around this, it's echoing around this chasm. So there's a huge amount of noise about what the future of the industry should look like and what technologies everyone should be taking up. But a lot of it is just that. It's just noise and it's just echo. And it causes I've seen it cause two distinct problems. The first problem is the fear of missing out. So people feel that suddenly they're massively behind the curve because they haven't, they haven't implemented artificial intelligence-based assessment within their business and have no plans to do that within the next 6 months. So this kind of massive fear of missing out, this fear that you've got an old mobile phone and everyone else has got an iPhone 10. So that's one thing that happens, and a lot of the companies that I work with. I'll do kind of reality checks for them, and they'll realize that actually many of the companies they compete with for talent are in exactly the same space as them. They're not adopting some of the weird and wonderful things we see out there. The flip side of it is very often, some of these topics, so take artificial intelligence, for example, can become so spun and so overblown and so kind of echo chambery that we ignore them altogether. We think, you know what, that's just nonsense, that's just hype, that's never going to happen. And that's a mistake as well. I found this quote the other day. I love this quote. This was a piece of advice that was given to Henry Ford's lawyer in 1903 about whether he should invest £5,000 of his own money in the Ford Motor Company. And the advice was, the horse is here to stay, but the automobile is only a novelty, a fad. Now, luckily for Henry Ford's nameless lawyer, he did invest his £5,000 in the Ford Motor Company and got a return of something like $12 million in old money, in 1920 or so. So, there's two problems: this fear of missing out, but also sometimes we get so bored with hearing about some of these innovations, we miss things that are actually going to be really, really important to the industry. I found this graph that really sums it up brilliantly in terms of where I like to position my interviews and my conversations, and it reflects back to what Andrea was saying about Facebook earlier. So this is a kind of a map of political conversations on Facebook, and if you go too far to the left, you have lots of people saying things and all agreeing with each other. So artificial intelligence is here for recruitment, and we need to implement it by Friday. Like. So you get this echo chamber where 50 people think the entire world agrees with them, and that's not actually the case. On the other side, flame wars, so lots of comments, people going, this is nonsense, this is absolutely rubbish, lots of pretty unuseful and sometimes very personal arguments that don't move the debate forward. And actually, where I like to sit is in this valley of open-mindedness where you can have productive discussions. So looking at things pragmatically and thinking about, what actually is the future, what's working, what is something that one company's doing that might work for lots of companies, and what's something that one company's doing that isn't really going to catch on as a trend. So on the back of when I got to 100 interviews, I decided to look back through all of the content. So it was 45 hours of content, so I didn't re-listen to all of it, but I went back and tried to see what were the trends that were coming through the interviews that I'd done. Now, I try and make the interviews as diverse as possible in terms of geography and industry and size of company. So I've interviewed people who work for 10 people startups. I've interviewed people who work for companies with hundreds of thousands of people. And what was really, really interesting when I looked at this kind of this body of information was there were several trends that kind of ran across everything. So what I want to kind of do is just sort of present what some of these trends are, talk a little bit about what I'm seeing and what I think is possible, and then give you, I can't play it, but I'll give you the highlights of one of the interviews that I've done with someone who I think very sort of pragmatically displays what this trend is in reality. So the rest of my presentation, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants. These are other people's content, and I've put links. I put links in them. Don't try and write them down because It's probably a bit tricky, but I'm sure you'll get a copy of the presentation afterwards, and you can just click through and listen to the whole interview if you're interested. So first up, recruiting strategy. And again, and I think this is a really interesting one. What I think I'm really starting to see is that a number of companies that really get this are seeing that actually recruiting is a way that a business can get massive competitive advantage that adds to the bottom line, rather than being just an HR-driven process. So it kind of sounds obvious, but I work with lots of companies where recruiting is still seen as a process. The influence that the recruiting team have in terms of the strategy of the business is very limited. But where this is being done well, and I think we saw it in Andrew's inside sales case study, looking at recruiting strategically can add tremendous value to a business. And as we move forward, it's becoming very clear that globally, for a number of reasons, everything from digital transformation to pressures on immigration, we're facing global skill shortages in lots of different areas. And actually, the companies that can win and attract the best talent to their business will be the companies that win. And I think there will be kind of winners and losers in the next few years around that competitive talent advantage. My example for this is actually Google. So Laszlo Bock was the kind of head of Google people operations globally. I think he left he's moved on to a startup a few months back, but I saw him do a presentation last week, and he was still talking about his time at Google. So if he's talking about it, then I'm going to talk about it. I was really lucky to interview him. Actually, he published a book a couple of years ago, and did a very kind of brief book tour. And he was in London for one day. And because you should always ask for things, I kind of sent a message to his publicist and said, "Can I interview him?" Thinking I'd get no response. And I was granted an interview. And the day he was in London, he was interviewed by the BBC, The Economist, and me. And it was only episode 14 of my podcast, so I didn't even have a very big audience. So that was that was kind of lucky. But from a recruitment strategy perspective, and the value back to the business, I think the key points about what he spoke about were really interesting. And first and foremost, it was the fact that he felt that hiring was the single most important people activity that any company can do. So, more important than any other aspect of HR. If you get hiring right, you can acquire exceptional talent to drive competitive advantage. And to kind of really sort of put their money where their mouth is there, Google spend a higher proportion of their overall budget on hiring than any other company, so they claim. And this is despite the fact that they get 3 million applications every year, which mostly arrive because of their brand and that people want to work there. So even though they've got that massive kind of flow of applications, they're spending more money on hiring as a percentage of their as a percentage than anyone else. The other interesting thing was, certainly back when this was recorded, Larry Page, who was the CEO at the time, approves every single hire. So they basically have a process where everyone they're hiring that week kind of gets wrapped up into a spreadsheet, and it eventually goes right to the top to be approved, which is interesting. I mean, it doesn't sound very efficient, but I think they found an efficient way of doing it. But it certainly sends a message of how important recruiting and getting the best people into that company is. So I think it's a great example, sort of, of a company that takes this incredibly seriously and sees it as, one of the most important things it does to drive competitive advantage. So there are a few other examples of sort of great thinking around recruitment strategy, but I think that's certainly a good one. So recruitment strategy. So more and more companies tying recruitment to business performance in new and interesting ways. The next one is recruitment marketing. I've always found this interesting. So I've worked in recruitment marketing since about 1999, but you could be forgiven for thinking that recruitment marketing was invented about 3 years ago by the way that some of the new tools that are coming into the market are spinning the fact that they've invented recruitment marketing. So when I kind of dig down into this, and I've got some great interviews and some really great examples of brilliant recruitment marketing. But what's becoming clear is as digital marketing gets more complex, more targeted, more interesting, a lot of the techniques and learnings from that are being brought across into recruitment marketing. So on the screen now are a couple of diagrams from a couple of UK-based companies who are offering different types of targeted programmatic advertising for recruiting. And I won't sort of go into the details of what this all means, but what's really interesting is the ability to track, to target very specific audiences, to nurture audiences with content over time, and to use technology to do that is adding a huge level of sophistication to recruitment marketing. So, I think this is going to be a massive trend that we can look to over the next sort of 2 or 3 years in terms of how we market our jobs and target the people that we're looking for. How an extra level of sophistication can come into that. My example for this one is from Salesforce. So I did an interview with Jennifer Johnson, who's the head of global employer branding for Salesforce, based in California. I liked this interview so much, it made it as a case study into the book. So if you read the book, you can read the full case study. But what was really interesting, what I thought was really interesting about this interview, it was very clear that Salesforce were applying a lot of the thinking and techniques that they use to market their product to actually find the hires that they were looking for. So I kind of flip back and forward a little bit. What's interesting, the problem they have is finding good enterprise software salespeople. That was their biggest recruitment pain. 500,000 applications a year, again driven by a very strong brand. Only 20% of those applications were actually suitable as potential hires. So a huge amount of noise, but actually very, very difficult for them to find people. So I've stolen one of her slides that kind of describes their process of recruitment. And interestingly, calling recruitment marketing targeted lead generation, I think is a really kind of interesting leap in terms of thinking. So what they do is they're very, very targeted about who they're looking for. They've kind of mapped out the audiences that they're talking to across the cities in which they're based. They do a lot of pre-qualifying in terms of they won't put anyone into their CRM database unless they meet the criteria to work there. So lots and lots of sort of pre-filtering and pre-qualification before they even attempt to speak to these people or build a relationship with them. And then it's kind of about building a relationship over time. So they're using something that the US analysts would call talent relationship marketing because we need another buzz phrase in our industry. There's just not enough. And what they're doing is, as I say, only putting people into their sort of talent pipeline who could potentially work there. But what's really interesting is they're nurturing those people over time. So they're building up a relationship with potential hires, maybe over a 2-year period until those people are ready to move. So they're constantly, sending out content, inviting people to events, and really nurturing those relationships over time. And I thought that's a really interesting, kind of really interesting example. So there are loads of other examples, but just in terms of taking that kind of very sophisticated digital marketing methodology and bringing it into recruitment, I thought this was a great one. The next one is data and analytics. And I think, again, this is a really interesting space. And I think that there are huge amounts of possibilities here in terms of what can be done. I genuinely believe that we'll move to an age of predictive analytics in recruitment, where we can make decisions and kind of predict what's going to happen. But actually, the reality is, we're a really long way away from that at the moment. So, I work with a couple of companies who can't even get data from their career sites in terms of what's going on. So, standing up on stage and declaring the predictive analytics era of recruiting is here is a very premature thing to do, because I think everyone is still struggling with collecting and analysing data, and also trying to work out, well, what should I actually measure and what's important in the recruitment process. And many companies still measuring things like time to hire, which may or may not be a useful thing to do. So my interview here isn't actually from a practitioner; it's from a US-based analyst. Carl is a kind of a very well-known analyst of the industry. He's kind of research manager at IDC, and he's done a lot of research into what he's calling data-driven recruiting. So, what companies are using what data to improve their recruitment, and kind of how does that work? So he describes data-driven recruiting as the measurement and analysis of talent data, and the application of data-based insights to optimize recruiting performance. So far, so good. We kind of get that. And one of the interesting things that came out in my interview with him is he'd done a survey. He surveyed employers who were using interesting amounts of data in their recruitment process, and he found something potentially quite disturbing. So 91% of those employers who are using doing this kind of data-driven recruitment were sharing that data with their executive teams. But only 23% were actually sharing it with the hiring managers that they worked with. And the point that he makes in the interview is that recruiting is getting harder and harder. So from a hiring manager perspective, it can seem that you kind of brief the recruitment team and they're not doing anything because they've not provided any candidates, and everything is broken. But actually, a huge amount of activity can be going on. And it's very much his belief that actually by sharing that activity in a much more scientific way, you can really look at what's going on, what are the outcomes, and what do companies need to do to improve things. So one of the examples he gives in the interview is the candidate experience, and realizing that actually, in a certain market, one company's competitor is doing so much better because they're actually offering a better candidate experience, which is helping their reputation. And actually understanding that through data means that the employer could improve their candidate experience and compete on an even playing field. So really, really interesting. So all about using data to explain what you're doing, try and work out what the outcomes are and how you can do that better. He also shares a really simple framework to move towards that, which I really liked. So stage one was measure what you can. What data do you actually have in your process? What can you measure? Stage two, talk to the business about what metrics are actually important, what people are paying attention to, what really matters, and then measure frequently and consistently. And I thought this was an interesting point, because he said that maybe some people only measure recruitment metrics when there's a request from higher up in the organisation to justify budget or headcount or something like that. And this was all about measuring frequently and consistently, and then analysing that data to try and get market intelligence. So I find this a fascinating area, because I think this is a place that lots of companies have got the furthest to travel. So kind of understanding, what's measurable in your recruitment marketing and your recruitment process would be a key place to start. Next up, employer branding. Employer branding is a topic that that causes a lot of echo in the chasm in terms of people arguing about whether it actually exists or what should be done. And I think this is really interesting. I recently did an exercise for a client of mine looking at how the most successful technology companies in terms of performance in hiring were actually communicating their employer brand. And this is one of the kind of examples I use. Anyone guess what company this is? No. Sorry? US Postal? No. Yes. So this is Facebook. And what I think is interesting about the way that Facebook kind of communicates their employer brand is it's, and Google does a very, very similar thing. It's kind of very emotional. It's looking for a sense of emotional engagement with the audience, talking about doing great work and making a difference to the world. Now, with Facebook, we know that actually making a difference to the world could potentially be quite negative. But I think that's kind of interesting. And what I found with the companies that I was working with, who are much more traditional, their employer brand was really all about them and what they did. And some of these really, really kind of great examples are actually all about you and what you could do if you went and worked for that company. So I think there's a huge amount of work and thinking round employer brand to still happen. I think one of the problems is if we went through this exercise in a particular industry and took the employer's logo off, you probably find that it's very, very difficult to tell the difference between everyone's sort of the way that people represent their employer brand. So the example I've got here, I love this example. So this is Ewan. Ewan is the employer brand manager for a bank called Standard Life. If you've not heard of Standard Life, they're a 200-year-old bank, and they're based in Edinburgh, which is where I'm based. And Edinburgh is a really interesting place. It's not a very big city. It is the capital of Scotland, but it's not a very big city. And it's dominated by banks and financial services companies, many of whom have a very kind of traditional, stuffy reputation, and have, in some cases, have been there for hundreds of years. And one of the challenges that people like Standard Life have is Edinburgh is also one of Europe's capitals, and probably people are going to argue with you now about where the European capital of fintech is, but Edinburgh is very, very strong in terms of the fintech industry. So huge amounts of financial technology startups being created there. So it's actually got, I hate to use this word, but almost like a cool startup culture. So lots of the very, very very, very best technical talent, being sucked into these kind of fintech organizations. So for a kind of a 200-year-old bank that's seen as very traditional, that's a kind of a really, really interesting branding challenge, because they need, they need these people in their business to compete, and build their own fintech products. So I think what they've done is really, really interesting. It's far more difficult for an established company to do this than someone like Google and Facebook, who are kind of created from the bottom up in the last 10 years. So to Ewan, his definition of employer brand is just one word, which is transparency. And it's like, what is it really like to work here? And a lot of the stuff that Standard Life do is actually dispelling myths about what they're like as a company. So they don't have a dress code. They've got great offices. They work on some fantastic software. You can really do sort of great work within the business. And their challenge is communicating that out, communicating that to an audience that has lots of preconceptions about what they do. And some of the things that they've done is, particularly in their early careers hiring, they've stopped using job adverts completely. And like my voice has just stopped completely. So they stopped using job ads completely, and they're now using stories as a way to talk about what the job's like. So interviewing people, doing Q&A with people, and using that as the actual job ad, rather than basing it on a job description. And they've all kinds of initiatives that they've done around this. And they've had some really great results. So in the last 2 years, they've gone from 65% of their recruitment coming from recruitment agencies to 5% in 2 years. And that's meant they've been able to avoid £1.5 million worth of spend. So, a fairly simple but clever tactic, done very consistently, and really good results, and is making them be competitive in a highly competitive marketplace. So I really love that example. Next up, recruiting technology. Lots of people on the podcast talk about recruiting technology. It's almost one of my set questions that whenever I've got anyone on, I ask them how technology is helping or hindering them. And recruiting technology is getting insanely complicated and difficult to understand. Just because there are so many companies with so many different offerings who are all kind of overlapping with each other or looking at one tiny bit of the process, and I think it can be really difficult, to understand. How can this technology help me and what do I need to buy? So this was just a simplified diagram I did for a client based on different categories of recruitment technology that were out there. I've seen other people do things that are far more complicated than that. I had a consultant on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he said that he'd identified 21 different categories of recruiting technology, basically, that you could use in kind of some kind of cascade. So insanely complicated, and how is someone who is doing a job for an employer supposed to make sense of all of these kind of overlapping systems, and what should they buy? So one of my favorite examples is from Brad Cook here. This is quite an old interview, it's a couple of years old. So when I spoke to Brad, he was working for Informatica, which is an international data company. He's now moved on elsewhere, but I think that the content of the interview is still stands. And really what comes across from talking to him is that he works on principles rather than being dictated to by technology. So he works out what he wants to do. He works out the guiding principles by which he's going to build his strategy, and he then went and found technology that supported that. So I think what happens sometimes is people do this completely the other way around. They buy a piece of technology because it sounded great, and then they're trying to sort of retrofit their strategy in to get the most out of the money they've spent. So it was really kind of working on core principles from the start. And one of the core principles that he refers to in the interview was the sense of capturing someone's data once and using it many times. So again, a company in a very competitive environment, looking at engineering talent and sales talent in Silicon Valley. And it was really like, if we can just grab someone's data and put them into a database and effectively use that to communicate with them over time, that's really important. And what was interesting was to him, because he was having conversations with potential candidates that were going on for 3 or 4 years sometimes, the single most important piece of data for him to collect was actually a mobile number. Because the thinking was that actually, who's changed their mobile number in the last 5 years? Not many people. A couple of people have. I've had my mobile number for 10 years now. So, as we change companies and as different platforms come in and out of vogue, his idea was that actually that, a lot of people keep their mobile number for longer, which I thought was quite interesting. So the whole of their approach to technology was based on that. He's using a lot of SEO. He's using a recruitment marketing platform, an ATS and a CRM to kind of pull this together. What was interesting is he also employed a research team who just went out and mapped the market and kind of identified the sort of people they needed to pull into their system. And that research team was human. So, it was a bunch of people kind of manually trying to find out what was going on. So, no flashy algorithms or artificial intelligence here, just humans doing research and using technology to make the most out of what they were finding. Also, just in terms of data analytics and understanding what's going on, he projected that actually to get the hires they needed from the active candidates that they were recruiting, they needed 300,000 visits to their career site and 2,000 applications, and that was their model. And everything they did back that up. So they invested in SEO to get the people to the site, and they checked that the way they were converting interest to make sure they got those applications. So a really interesting example of using data modeling to actually inform how your recruitment marketing strategy should work. So that's the recruitment technology piece. The last one is the future. The podcast is the Recruiting Future podcast, so it would not be complete unless we had some, crazy gazing into the future. And I've had people talk about some pretty futuristic stuff, which has been really interesting. So difficult to sort of pick out a specific interview to talk about the future. So what I'm doing is what I want to do with this section is just tie it back to the kind of the research that we did for the book, and another piece of research that I've just finished round employer branding. So rather than the future in terms of technology, this is the future in terms of what will companies have to do to make sure they get the kind of exceptional talent that the guy from Google was talking about. So in the book, we kind of identify. You probably can't read this. Appallingly small type. So just enjoy the coloured circles. So in the book, we identify that actually someone's life cycle at a company, from the point at which you reach out to them about a job to the point at which they leave and beyond, is actually an experience. And in HR and recruiting, we tend to deliver this as a series of processes. So we saw in our research that people will be brilliant at recruiting and terrible at onboarding because they were done by different departments with different objectives, and that was kind of undermining the whole kind of search for talent. And likewise, so to sort of take these round, it's attention, attraction, acquisition, onboarding, development, and retention. And how that works as a cycle, I think is really critical in terms of how you get and keep the best talent in your business. And all of this could be looked at under the label of employee experience. And the research that I've just concluded with my colleague Mervyn Dinnan, who was my co-author on the book, we looked at the relationship between employer brand and employee experience, and how that worked within organisations. So we spoke to I think we spoke to 20 global heads of employer branding and then surveyed another 500 to see how much kind of control and influence and importance they had on employee experience, because employee experience is the kind of key differential in terms of talent. Rather than put an interview with myself up, I've picked this interview with author and futurist Jacob Morgan, who some people like, some people don't. Jacob's one of these Jacob's a professional speaker on the future of work, but he's very, very research based in his methodology. And he published a book earlier this year called The Employee Experience Advantage, which is consistently listed higher on Amazon than my book. So it must be good. And what I think is interesting about the interview here is in his book, he set out to explore the problem of ineffective employee engagement. So everyone talks about employee engagement and talks about it as a potential competitive differentiator in their recruitment process. But actually, what he was seeing was that many companies really weren't doing it very well. And actually, if you look at the stats of how disengaged people are with their work, it just doesn't actually tally up to the amount of money that's spent on employee engagement. So he wrote his book. He had 5 researchers, 2 data scientists, and analysed 252 companies to actually look at what's happening. And he talks about this in the interview. He found that actually most companies are providing their employees with a really kind of outdated working environment and distracting them with nice perks. And that was his kind of definition of employee engagement. It's like, we're going to give you stuff and tell you stuff to distract from the fact that your laptop doesn't work and we all use Lotus Notes. Whatever it might be, which I think was interesting. And in the book and in the interview, he talks about, the employees, the companies that he feel actually get it right, are offering what he calls experiential organizations, and companies who go right back to strip everything back and work out how they can give the best employee experience. And really the three things that he focuses on are the culture, the physical space, and that includes how companies work with remote workers, and the tools that people actually use. So I think that's interesting because they're things that aren't necessarily talked about very much in employee engagement presentations, kind of very practical. Okay, I'm pretty much out of time, so just a few links in the presentation. If you want to know more, I did a whole white paper with sort of 5 or 6 interviews for each topic, so you can get a sort of diverse section of thought there. If you want to listen to the podcast, this is the website. Also available on iTunes. It has its own app as well, Android and iPhone app. Please buy my book, and thank you very much.